Today to be joined by Niyeti, and we are going to be talking about responsible food policy. So maybe to kick us off, could you give us a little bit of an intro on yourself?
Sure, absolutely. I'm so excited to be here. So thank you for inviting me to chat. So my name's Niyeti. I'm the founder of Food Systems Collaborative. We're a consulting agency that helps organizations and companies engage in food policy with a little bit more of a focus on coalition building, kind of that grassroots advocacy feel, a little bit less on the lobbying side. And kind of how I got introduced to food policy was through food donations, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. But we do also do quite a bit of work on the food donation side, helping organizations set up food donation policies or, help them kind of reach excellence in their food donation programs however they can.
Amazing. I'm super excited to talk about this. And before we dive into more of the corporate side, I do think it's interesting to note that the US government has a commitment to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030, which honestly, I just kind of found out when we started talking about this. And I think it's fascinating because we always focus on what corporations are doing. And I don't feel like there's a lot of a spotlight on what the government has set out to do or what they're doing in their own procurement practices. And I want to also highlight that food loss and waste in the United States accounts for approximately a third of the overall food supply in our country. So it's definitely a huge thing to consider. And it is also something that's really important to think of when we think about municipal waste. And what we see is that landfills obviously have a huge amount of methane that are coming out of them due to food waste. And food waste, loss, and waste is one of the single largest components that's actually disposed of at the landfill. And so it is the third largest source of methane in the United States. And that's really significant when we talk about climate. So I digress, but I think that it would be super interesting to talk a little bit more about your work with food donation and with corporations. And maybe you could give us a little bit of a breakdown on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I love that you brought up this government perspective. It's really amazing that there are actually a lot of government commitments. Most recently, there was the National Strategy on Food Loss and Waste that came out from the White House as well that I'd encourage folks to take a look at. It does include a lot of public-private partnership commitments around food loss and waste. So we are kind of really fortunate to see that there is a decent amount of agency engagement and policy engagement. And so kind of how I got into the food loss and waste space is I was working at Weight Watchers at a previous role a couple years ago, and we had heard from one of our members actually that they were running into some issues with food donation at their food bank. And they asked, like, would we be able to help and see what's going on? And it turned out that there is a piece of legislation called the Emerson Act, which was passed in 1996 that gives folks liability protection to donate food. But it was written in 1996. Food donation has changed quite a lot since then, as you can imagine, as have the food donors themselves. And so there were pieces of that legislation just that didn't totally apply anymore. And a lot of food banks were hearing from organizations that, oh, we actually don't have liability protection to donate food. We can't give you the food, which isn't completely true, but because of the way the legislation was written, you could totally see why that was coming up and why that made sense. And so it kind of launched into this really interesting, exciting journey of corporate engagement in food policy. And we started, really rooted on the nonprofit side because this is the primary folks affected are nonprofit organizations and folks that do receive food, and bringing them into the conversation early to look at legislation, to get feedback on legislation, which doesn't always happen. And so it was really, I think, exciting also for the policymakers to have feedback from folks on the ground who could tell them very realistically how this would impact, the people who have to deal with this every single day, and brought that into Congress. We authored an open letter and then brought together a little over 70 companies and nonprofit organizations to champion the bill. We were very fortunate to have it pass. But I think where that is so exciting to me and kind of my role now is it was a really interesting example of, I think food policy passing as a standalone, which is crazy. That never happened. So it was amazing just to see that there was so much energy and excitement there. It was really bipartisan, which I think in this day and age is a good thing to remind people. Like, food waste and food recovery is in fact a bipartisan issue that everybody should and can get behind. And we had so many stakeholders at the table because this does affect a ton of people. It affects industry, it affects retail, it affects nonprofit organizations, it affects schools. And so to see kind of corporations really thoughtfully engaging with nonprofit partners to echo their platform and to understand that they are the advisors, like they are the experts in this space, but what can we do to amplify their effort was what we focused that on. And I think ultimately why we were successful, which was really exciting.
That is super exciting. And I feel like that, is some farther past example, but isn't there some pretty exciting stuff that's also on the docket for Congress upcoming?
Yeah, I think one that jumps out to me on the food waste side is the Food Date Labeling Act. So a huge amount of food waste in this country is quite frankly due to date labels. So I'm sure you've seen it like best by, use this by, sell by. None of that is actually regulated in the US except for infant formula, which is crazy. So California actually just passed a date labeling standardizing bill. And then in Congress, we do have a piece of legislation that would standardize into two labels, one to identify quality and one to identify safety. And the reason this is so exciting, I think first people think, well, awesome, great for kind of industry to start to standardize these terms that will make everything easier. But also, consumers need to know what these terms mean, right? We're so used to maybe you grew up in a household where the minute that day passed, it was like, throw that out. We're not eating that. No way. Or you grew up in a house where you do a sniff test and decide to eat it, but it's so confusing. And with the way that food prices are rising now as well, it also just brings up this opportunity to keep some extra dollars in folks' wallets that they're spending on food. And then another really interesting part about the Food Date Labeling Act is there is a really big like nonprofit food recovery component to it because it's very complicated to set standards around what food can be recovered when all of these dates mean different things, and making those judgment calls based on the product or based on the manufacturer is incredibly difficult. And it's also very hard to educate people that maybe if that date has passed, the food is in fact still safe. So I'd say at the federal level, the Food Date Labeling Act is something that so many of us have our eye on and are really excited about. And I do think could actually gain a ton of traction next year. And I know there's coalitions like the Zero Food Waste Coalition, as well as a lot of industry and nonprofit support behind it. So we're excited to hopefully see that move.
That is super exciting. And I think it hits so many levels of the fact that households account for 40 to 50% of food waste in the US, but also that idea of education. And if there's an educational component with that policy that's really going to help people understand what those terms mean and what it is on the package
Yeah.
itself, I think that it's going to have like a double impact, which is really, really exciting. Now, this is all like pretty high level and pretty policy oriented, but given you've kind of paved a path here, what would you recommend that people could do if they want to get involved either in their personal or professional lives?
What a thoughtful question. I would say one really easy thing to do is we have a newsletter called the Food Policy Debrief, and I can share that link, but we just kind of break down these policy issues 101 at the most basic level to help folks get introduced to food policy. So I'd encourage you to subscribe and help learn there. The second piece is if you are engaged in your organization or your nonprofit, start to think a little bit about like what are those policy ties that I could have. And it's not always federal. Sometimes it's maybe a state level issue or a local issue that you are running into. And figure out like, is there a way for me to address some of these barriers that I'm having in my role through government? And if that is the route you go, there are some great resources. We're about to actually publish a number of advocacy resources on our website, foodsystemscollaborative.com, that I would encourage you to check out. And of course, this is the thing that I'm most excited about in the world. So you can always reach out to me and I'm happy to help plan or see what I can do to help you kind of get engaged in food policy. Because I think no matter where you work, especially if you touch climate, there is a food policy tie and it is a really bipartisan issue. And so especially if it's the first time maybe your company is getting engaged in this way or your nonprofit is, this is a really safe place to start. And we need more people at the table. We need more voices at the table to help, come up with these comprehensive policies that are going to address these issues head on.
I love that. Well, we'll definitely link those resources. So if anyone wants to get into those 101s, they can review them. And I think that it's really exciting to consider we have our local, we have our state, we have our federal opportunities to get involved. And not to make this political, but we do have elections upcoming. And so another way I do think individuals might be able to really lean in is voting and thinking about, local to me, composting just became available in all boroughs of New York City. And that's a super easy way to help reduce food waste. And it has a huge impact. So that's something that New York City voters voted for. And, there's many things like that all around. So definitely something to keep
Amazing.
in mind. But I really appreciate the time and you helping to break down some of this policy, complicated terminology into super digestible things. We're excited to help make climate topics a little bit more accessible and talk to cool people. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.